Hi everyone, my name is Paul Procedural, and I'm a technical artist at SideFX focusing on the games segment of our business. Today I'm going to show you how Houdini can be used to enhance your workflows inside of Unity using directed procedural workflows. So I'll be covering a variety of topics, including SessionSync, which is something brand new that we've introduced for the Houdini Engine plugin for Unity. I'll be covering SideFX Labs, which is a completely free toolset for Houdini focused on creating content for games a lot easier and faster. And then last but not least, I would like to point you towards some resources that you can look at yourself after this talk to see what all the cool things are that you can do with Houdini for Unity. In this example, I'm going to show you how you can use Houdini Engine together with the newly introduced SessionSync to procedurally place objects inside of Unity using Houdini Engine and the proceduralism that Houdini offers in a node-based workflow. So what I'd like to do is add a bunch of these moss pieces that we have here to these edges. And I'd also like to take a bunch of these ground clover objects and just scatter those on top of the surface. So what I could do is I could create a Houdini digital asset that does this for me, and I just feed it an input. But I'd like to go a bit further than that. I'd like to be able to modify my procedural network instead of just being locked down with a single digital asset. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to the top here under Houdini Engine and click on SessionSync. And this will open this window that we see here, which will allow us to either start Houdini or connect to Houdini. In this case, because I don't have a Houdini session, I'm going to start a new one. Once Houdini is started, we can see that we have this Houdini Engine SessionSync window where we can see that our connection is successful together with Unity. If I were to split my screen and enable Sync Viewport, and move around in either the Unity or in the Houdini viewport, right? Rotating around like this, we can see that both of these viewports are synced, which allows me to, see objects in the correct location and context if I were to bring in, for example, the entire scene. For the time being, in my example, we don't really care about that, so I'm just going to disable that. So what we'd like to do is scatter objects on, these rocks that we have in the environment. And what we need to do first is, of course, bring that geometry into Houdini. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new node using this interface here, where we're going to just call this rocks. And I'd like the type to be input because we're generating input for Houdini. So when we click create, we can see that it has created a new object here in our hierarchy. And if we look at our inspector, we can see that we have, what we usually have with Houdini Engine as well, this really nice interface. I'm going to quickly lock the interface because I don't want it to be jumping around when selecting objects. So I just locked it real quick. Next up, what we need to do is, of course, tell it what geometry to send to Houdini. So the way I'm going to do that is just add 3 slots as input objects. And the reason I do that is because I want to specify 3 objects to be used as inputs. I have this big rock here. I have this smaller rock over there. And I want this rock over here as input number 3. So now if we were to go back to Houdini, we can see that it has brought those objects into Houdini session at the correct location relative to where Unity has the objects located in the world or in the environment. We can also see that we have 3 new green nodes and this merge object. We can just turn off the display for these nodes because all of those get merged into this object here. And if we look at this node here, we can see that we indeed have this object merge, which grabs all of those objects for us. All right, so this is what we need for our input. We, of course, also want to bring data from Houdini into Unity. And the way we do that is by once again going back to this Houdini Engine SessionSync window and, make another node. So in this case, I'm just going to call it asset placement. And we're going to change the type from input to experimental, SOP, and then subnet. and then simply once again click create. If we then scroll down, we can see that we now indeed have this asset placement node, which has also been created here inside of Houdini. So if we dive inside this asset placement node and, for example, create a sphere SOP, right? And we go back inside of Unity. Let's move this out of the way once again. Focus on our asset placement objects that we created. We can see that we have that sphere just like we expect. If we were to change this to, for example, be a box, we will see that it is now a box, right? So there's no secret stuff going on here. It's literally just sending one object or multiple objects or an entire scene to Houdini, and it is using a different asset to bring data from Houdini into Unity. And we're going to use this system to scatter these objects on our environment. So to scatter objects, what I'm going to do is go inside this asset placement node, and instead of using those spheres and boxes, I'm going to, first of all, change my interface to be showing the parameter interface of the node that I have selected, and change the input, right, of this object merge to be this input underscore object, which if we visualize it, we can see that that is simply all of those objects that we fed into it. We could, of course, also only import, the first rock or the other rock or the other rock or a very specific object that we want. But in this case, I only, care about the thing as a whole. So I just import that. Next up, we're going to drop down a scatter SOP. And if we connect the wire and turn on the display flag, we can see that it scattered objects all over the place. That is not quite what we want. So I'm going to drop down an attribute paint so that we can paint on the surface of that geometry. If we then select this node and set the display flag on there and use mouse wheel to increase the scale of our brush, we can see that we're now, painting on the surface of these objects here. So let's paint a little bit here and let's paint a little bit here. It doesn't need to be perfect. We can always go back to tweak this since it is nice and procedural. So what we need to do in our scatter SOP is, of course, also tell it to use that attribute paint that we created to scatter with. So in this case, it created a mask attribute. So I'm just going to tell it to use that. And now we can see that it is indeed using that attribute painted value to do that. So going to a scatter and increasing the scatter a little bit to 180 instances and decreasing the relax iterations, we now have a nice amount of scatter over there. Next up, I'm going to use the flow map tool from SideFX Labs to create some attributes that will control the direction of the objects that we instance. So if we set this to be slope and set the down vector to be -1, which is downwards in Houdini, we will now have a velocity attribute because that's what flow maps use. And we're just going to abuse the flow map tool a little bit and convert that vector of velocity into a normal vector, right? Which is v at a capital letter N in vex, and set that to be v at n equals v. So that now if we enable our normals and go here to the display options and scale up the normals a little bit, we can see that they're now all oriented according to the slope of the objects. I'm also going to give it a name, s@name equals, and then just call it, plants, like that. And then what we want to do is also give it a up vector. So v at up equals set 0, 1, 1, because up equals y equals 1 in Houdini. Next up, we're going to drop down a attribute value replace, which is going to replace some of the name attribute values with another attribute called Unity instance, because we want to instance our objects. We don't just want to copy geometry. And we're going to instance some of the objects that we find here inside of Unity, right? So we want to instance these prefabs. So let's copy the path of this ground cover 1 object and simply, replace the plans value with that asset path. And if we were to now set our display flag on that node and go back inside of Unity, we can see that it indeed did scatter these objects. If we once again, see things side by side and change the number of scatters, we can see that we can indeed, increase or decrease the number of objects that we want to scatter on our surface. If you want to go back and change the painting location, for perhaps remove some of the scatter here in the front because we want to place some other objects there, then we can simply do that. And as we can see, we did indeed remove the paint there, and therefore also remove the scatter there. So as you can see, SessionSync allows you to use all of the interactive tools that Houdini has to offer. Next up, let's do something a little bit more interesting than simply a scatter. We want to use some of the other tools that Houdini has. So let's create a draw curve SOP, which will allow us to draw curves on geometry. As we can see, it created that grid here at the bottom, which is our projection surface. And I want to change that projection surface to be the incoming geometry, which means that now if we draw on the on this blue mesh that we see, the curves that we're drawing are colliding with that surface. So if we were to draw some nice looking curves here, like that, and perhaps also place some of those curves over here, we can use the exact same thing we did before, which is scattering, right? Scatter some points on there. Don't make it 1,000. We don't quite need 1,000 pieces of moss. And once again, reduce the relax iterations a little bit so it looks a bit more organic. Next up, what we need to do is, of course, create that normal attribute. And for that, I'm going to attribute transfer the normals of the geometry to the points itself. So what we need to do is take our geometry, generate some normals, because we don't quite know if it has normals already. And now if we, visualize that, we can see that we do indeed have normals. They are, however, pointing upwards, which is not what we want. So I'm going to drop down and adjust normal SOP, once again from SideFX Labs, and remove the Y component, because we don't want the Y component of our normal to be present. Then, similarly like before, we're going to set the name and the up vector, and remove this N attribute and just change this to be moss. So now we'll have a point cloud with those plants, and one with the moss. So if we merge those two streams together, we now have both of those point clouds, which we can now feed into the output of our node, which is this attribute value replace. And once again, we're going to change the name from moss to hanging moss 02, copy that path. And as we can see, we now have that moss nicely placed on our object. Then next up, I'd like to randomize the scale a little bit. So I'm going to drop down an attribute randomize and set the value to be p-scale, which is a uniform scale attribute that Houdini uses. And as we can see, I can just simply specify what the range has to be between which it is going to create that p-scale attribute. So if we make that something nice, like perhaps 0.1 and 1.8, we can see that it created some nice looking variation in terms of that scatter. And same goes here with the foliage. And that's how easy it is to use Houdini and SessionSync to create some highly art-directable but procedural layouts in Unity. So that was one example. Here is another example. So in this case, we have our procedural building that we have in Houdini on the left side, and then we have that exact same building on the right side inside of Unity. And as we can see, if I change the prefab of the model inside of Houdini by copying the path inside of Unity, we can see that it automatically switches the prefabs to be the correct one. And as you can see, there's a huge amount of benefits to working this way, because you're able to modify any of your network procedurally, right? The placement of your windows, for example, placement of buildings or placements of cities as a whole, and all of that will automatically update inside of Unity. So you have the full flexibility of Houdini right inside of Unity. So let's get to the second part of the presentation, which is about SideFX Labs. So some of the tools that we saw in the previous two videos are part of SideFX Labs. So what is it? SideFX Labs is a completely free open source toolset geared towards assisting Houdini users with a variety of tasks commonly used for digital content creation. So it has a lot of tools, digital assets, shelves, and these HDAs that you can, for example, use inside of Unity that are created by the games team at SideFX completely free. It is source available and completely free once again. We have over 210 tools at this point, meaning there's definitely something in there that can help you speed up and improve your workflows. We provide daily updates and we primarily focus on improving the workflow and UX that content creators have working with Houdini for game engines. If you want to know more about SideFX Labs, I recommend you go to this webpage, which you can find on sidefx.com, and then under products, click on SideFX Labs, where you can see a lot of the tools that we have created in SideFX Labs. So you can find all of them, do a simple search by clicking on that SideFX Labs button, where you can see all of those tools that we've created. But you can also find lots of links to talks that a lot of game studios have done, showing what their use cases are for Houdini. So what we see here is a lot of integrations and a lot of content focused tools. So I wanted to highlight a couple of these. So this one is called Pick and Place, which is a tool that very easily allows you to interactively place objects inside of Houdini by simply moving the mouse and clicking and dragging to set the scale, rotation, and so forth. So you might be wondering, why would I do this inside of Houdini instead of just placing objects inside of Unity? Well, the great thing of working procedurally like this with this tool is that, let's say you're placing your objects here, and then afterwards you're doing a scatter to place grass for your game. This placement of objects would then automatically feed into that other system and therefore adjust. So this means that while you're working on your game instead of Unity, you can then focus on more important things rather than for example having to keep modifying the placement of your grass because you simply moved an object around. So as you can see, this tool allows for recursive placements of objects on each other, right? Meaning you can place rocks on top of rocks, but you can also set it to ignore that and of course tweak any of the placements that you've made. Other than that, there's lots of other really cool enhancements that we have made for this tool, so definitely check it out and give this tool a try. Next up, TriPlanar Displacement. So let's say we have our low poly geometry that we've created in Houdini, and before we import it into Unity, we want to up-res it, right? We want to add some detail. What we could do is of course sculpt it, but the other approach that we can take is, for example, take some displacement maps that we have either generated in Houdini or that we have imported from somewhere else, and then use that to project and displace the geometry that we have. So in this case, we can see that there's lots of controls to sort of remove any repetitive elements, such as, for example, distorting the displacement with some noise. And then here's that use case I was talking about, where we have that low poly building that we simply, up-res by using a displacement texture to give it some actual shape, right? So give it a nice silhouette. After we've created our high poly like this, we can, for example, poly reduce it and bake it so that it's nice and performant for our game. But we could also, of course, push this forward in the content creation pipeline to do any further sculpting, for example. Next up, Box Cutter, which is another really great tool that we've added about a year ago at this point. Which allows you to use the very powerful procedural Boolean tool that we have in Houdini in a more interactive sort of way. So what we've done is we've taken that Boolean tool and we've wrapped it in something called Python states, which is a way of wrapping your node networks into a more interactive sort of control that you can script using simple Python. And that allows us to, create tools such as this that make things a lot more interactive, which is, for example, great for creating blockouts that you can then import into Unity, right? One of the use cases, for example, is building a simple blockout with SessionSync to modify some geometry that you have inside of Unity. Next up, physics. SideFX and Houdini is also very well known for their physics solutions, right? So one of the things that we of course want to offer is the ability to paint objects in a physically based manner. So in this case, as you can see, I have some twigs and some pine cones, and by simply drawing and hitting play in the timeline, we can see that those objects are automatically simulating and therefore falling, giving us a very realistic placement of objects that is physically plausible, right? And then what we can do is we can do that iteratively. We can, simulate, paint, have it, fall down, and then do that again and again until we have something that we like. Once we're done simulating, we can then automatically replace any of the simulated objects with more high-resolution objects, for example, the game geometry, before we export it out into the game engine. So looking back at that SessionSync example, imagine a workflow where you have your level, right? You've placed all your objects, and you would like to add some more natural looking objects, right? Or object placements. You could simply import your scene with SessionSync, use Physics Painter to paint your objects, and then send it back to Unity once you're done. So in this next example, I'm going to show you Mapbox, which is a really cool integration that we've done for SideFX Labs as well, which allows you to browse to any location on Earth through coordinates or through that lookup window that you saw, and then import that as a terrain inside of Houdini. And as you can see, it imports that as height information and all the color information that comes with it as well. It's also very easy to import even larger sets of terrain using this system by simply telling it to also look at neighboring tiles. The cool thing is that you can use this for example, as your actual level, right? Your terrain. You can use this as backdrops or anything else you want. And the other really cool thing is that it's very easy to split it up into smaller tiles, easy for streaming. The other next tool, of course, I'd like to show is a trim texture, which is a workflow that allows for unwrapping geometry so that you can place all of the UV shells on, for example, a trim, as we can see here on the right. So what this helps us do is, for example, create different styles of texturing objects without having to completely re-UV or rebake our object. So great for making an optimized material assignment to objects. So here we see the result of taking this building that we see here and automatically applying this trim texture to it, right? So it automatically wants to UV unwrap this and figures out the right placement for our UVs on this texture in texture space. So what that does for us is produce this result we see here. So we took this trim texture and automatically unwrapped all of this geometry to be assigned here. And as you can see, it produces some really, really nice results. And keep in mind that I did not do any manual tweaking. All of this is completely automatic, completely procedural, without any manual input. There are, of course, some decisions that the tool makes that you might want to tweak, but that is something that we'll take a look at a little bit on how you can fine-tune those decisions that Houdini has made. Because, of course, we want to give you the ability to art direct what you're doing. You're not simply building a system in Houdini and then having it do its thing and hoping it's right. No, we want you to have full control over what it generates. Here's another example where we have this sort of geometry, sort of like a balcony, and by simply plugging it into the trim texture tool, you saw how fast it is, right? So here we have no UVs. Once we put the display flag on the trim texture tool, we can see it's already done cooking, so that took less than a second. And then if we look at it, we can see that we have some really, really nice trim assignments. And as we can see, it automatically figured out that this, should be this curved piece should automatically be straightened into a nice straight piece, so that we get those nice little edge wear that we see here on our marble texture, which of course could be any sort of a shader. And we can also see that this more complex geometry would be very boring to UV manually. It also automatically does that for you. So here we see, if we take that balcony geometry, we copy it a bunch of times in a radial fashion, we then bend it, and there we go, we have something really cool, sort of like a Colosseum-like geometry. So that was just a diffuse texture. Of course, if we were to assign a normal map to that and have some bevels in there, we can fake bevels, essentially, right? So all of this geometry you saw was just hard edges, 90-degree edges. But when we assign our normal map to that, we can see that we have some really nice 45-degree beveled edges. So once we have our automatic assignment, we can of course fine-tune that by using the interactive trim texture tool, which allows us to assign and modify trim texture assignments in the viewport by simply using our mouse and the mouse wheel, or the middle mouse button. We can change the assignment, we can scale the assignment, we can rotate the assignment, we can translate the assignment, allowing us to really fine-tune the art that we are creating for our games. And then of course, once we're done with that, we can just assign our final material, and we can see that we have some really cool looking results by simply clicking to assign some material assignments. Let's get to the third part of the talk, which is about how can you learn Houdini and how can you expand upon your Houdini knowledge. The best thing I would recommend is going to our learning paths on the SideFX.com website, which breaks down Houdini into all these sort of different components that you might want to learn. For example, if you want to learn modeling, you can click this one. If you want to learn pyro, fluids, destruction, you can click those. If you want to learn world building, cloth, hair, fur, crowds, or anything else that you need for your game, you can just click on those categories and it will show you everything that we have curated. There are, of course, also a lot of community-created tutorials that you can find on our website as well. For example, here, the Houdini Pro Builder for Unity tutorial to design levels inside of Unity. All of these are either community-created or staff-created by SideFX, but you can just simply sort on categories, you can sort on experience level, and find anything that you need. Next up, I'd like to talk a bit about Houdini Engine. So we've seen a lot of really cool things that you can do with it. I just want to point out that thanks to Unity, we're now a verified solution partner, meaning that our Houdini Engine plugin is now available on the store. This means that you can simply go there, click on Add to My Assets, and install it by simply pressing a few buttons. The courses that I'm going to show you after this slide all have digital assets and all of the project files for Unity that you can download and install just to check it out yourself. You don't need to know Houdini to install these assets and use them. You'd only have to look at the parameters and modify properties of them. So let's take a look at a couple of these. First one being the sci-fi panel generator. So this is a subset of a larger course which teaches you how you can build this completely procedural but art-directable sci-fi corridor by modeling all of the pieces procedurally inside of Houdini, by creating prefabs inside of Unity, and how you can instance those prefabs inside of Unity. So this is a really great one, and once again, just find this on our website and click on Scene Files and Assets to get all of the assets and get the final project just to check it out and try it out yourself inside of Unity. Next up, a Game Jam starter kit. So not so long ago, we had our first Houdini Game Jam, and we wanted to provide users with a way to create games without necessarily having to build everything from scratch inside of Houdini. We wanted you to focus on creating cool looking games. So what we did is we built a lot of example files, a lot of production ready digital assets that you can import inside of Unity. For example, this rock generator, the foliage generator, a tree generator, a scatter for all of that. And of course, tutorial videos on how to use all of those, and even videos on how to build all of those. So this is another one that I really recommend you check out. The other tutorial or course that I'd like to point you towards is this guard tower made by Kenny Lammers from IndiePixel. This is a really great tutorial about how you can use a lot of input types to create levels, for example, with curves or with scattering or with manual placement, and how to model all of that procedurally inside of Houdini. It's a 29 tutorial series, so it is a lot of content for you to check out. Once again, all of the art assets, the source files, and the final project files are all accessible from our website. If you're looking for something a bit more intermediate or advanced, I would also like to point you towards the PDG for indie game developers series, which focuses on creating procedural open world levels instead of Unity using the procedural dependency graph in Houdini. So what that means is it's a lot of words, but it essentially allows you to efficiently generate only the things that you need inside of Unity. So if, for example, you're modifying an object in a specific location inside of your world, Houdini Engine and PDG would automatically be able to figure out what needs to be updated automatically to ensure that everything is correct. So for example, if you move the road, it would know what pieces of foliage to, recook or update inside of your scene. And that is it for my presentation today. Thank you very much for attending. I hope this was useful to you and that you have something that you look forward to trying out yourself. And once again, thank you very much to Unity for allowing us to participate in this event. Thank you.